Sorti à tête royale, moins dit où, non m'l'en débatté.
Sergio,
Ben arrivé, aïe nous ja swingé.
Sergio,
Ben arrivé, yep pas, ou ba nous les news.
Sergio,
Non m'l'en arrivé, aïe moins content. J'ai mon tombé. Non m'l'en pas les payer. Moi benae. Ou crier bena souffler. Bena kassamango. Regardez-moi, on nous parle en foi. On parle de la on parle de on parle de la on fait bail. On parle de la personne. Moi quel pété ou à sous de mango. Woy bandit. Allez mettez votre volonté.
Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now of the ACA Cashew Barometer.
Hi, I'm Salma. I'm the CEO of Ivoirienne de Noix de Cajou. Today, cashews are faceless, and our aim is to give cashews an identity. More than 40% of raw nuts in the world are produced in Ivory Coast, and we believe the cashew identity should be African. So we set up this factory to connect the value chain between the farmers and the consumers. The farmers are fragmented and the consumers are disconnected, and we are here as the processor to connect the two and tell you the story. And this is the story about creating jobs for women and youth in a country that has grown cashews historically but not processed.
Je m'appelle Amani Lukushal.
assoiffé.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, Tibay, aïe, fout moins content. Sorti à tête royale, moins dit où, non me l'en débarqué.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, aïe nous ja swingé.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Ben arrivé, yep ba, ou ba nous les news.
Sergio, Sergio, ben arrivé.
Non me l'en arrivé, aïe moins content. J'ai mon tombé. Woy, woy, woy. Non me l'ont pas les payer. Moi, benae. Wakriye bena souple. Bena kasamango. Regardez-moi, on nous parle en foi. On parle ni la hamon, on parle pas. On parle comme bando là. On parle pas la hamon, on dit la hamon. Va faire bail. On va travailler la personne, on parle ni. Moi quel pété ou à sous de mango. Woy 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 woy. Woy 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 bandit. Allez mettez votre volonté.
Recording in progress.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this edition of the Global Markets Encounter. I see Jim is already showing his video and ready to shoot. Before I invite him to start, let me also mention that this is coming to you in English with simultaneous translation in French. And you can select the language of your choice by clicking on interpretation, which is at the bottom right corner of your screen. Let me also mention that in addition to Zoom, where you are all joining, there are also participants who are joining us through Facebook, YouTube, and then MS Teams. I welcome all of you who are with us for these networks. Again, let me acknowledge our sponsors and partners who have made this possible. And here I'm talking about Cashew Info from Cashew, CNFA Pro Cashew, Technotel Benin Cashew, SNI, and Intersnack Procurement. So thank you so much for making this possible. And for those of you joining us, thank you for being with us. At this moment, let me introduce to you Jim Fitzpatrick, who has always been the one who has supported us to come up with this content and to present it to us. Today, we're talking about markets, Cashewnomics 3. We had Cashewnomics 1, 2, and now we're going to Cashewnomics 3. It will be in two parts. The first part, Jim will be talking about the latest market development and also the issue of COVID in major processing countries. And then the second part, we will have Ram and also Jean Rao join in to have a conversation with Jim Fitzpatrick, particularly on the market in the western part of West Africa, here Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Senegal in that western part of West Africa. It will then be followed by the continuation of this topic, where he will then delve deep into Cashewnomics 3. So without wasting much time, Jim Fitzpatrick, can you hear me, Jim?
Good morning, Ernest. How are you?
I'm fine. I hope you are well too.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm busy.
Okay, very good.
In good form.
Very good. So please take over, and the participants are ready for you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. If you're further east, hope you're all doing well. Ernest has told you what we're going to talk about today. I'm especially happy to welcome our guests, Ram Mohan and John Rao. I'll tell you more about them a little bit later on, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. Don't forget you can type questions into the chat, and we're going to have questions after the discussion with Ram Mohan and with John. So type your questions into the chat as we go. We're always happy to see them. We're always happy to have those discussions. We're especially happy to be questioned on some of the opinions that, particularly the ones I'm going to voice in the next 30 minutes or so. So let's talk about markets, and let's talk about the recent market developments. And I'll start by just looking at some of the talking points that have arisen over the past couple of weeks. The factors that are engaging many people and indeed puzzling many of us on how this market is developing or how it might develop in the second half of 2021. So let's start, as we usually do, with Vietnam. We have seen an impact of COVID, a greater impact than previously of COVID in Vietnam in the past couple of weeks. That's been a major talking point. We're seeing a standoff on raw cashew nuts between stockholders and processors in Vietnam, and to a certain extent between exporters in West Africa and the Vietnamese cashew sector. We're seeing this really difficult problem on freight, problem on logistics that's been emerging for months, but has really come to a very difficult situation in the last 6 weeks or so. But we're also seeing surging exports from Vietnam throughout 2021, but it appears to be getting and gaining momentum as the year goes on, which is very encouraging, of course. In India, we see a reopening in some states. It's going step by step after a really very difficult second wave of the pandemic in India. This has had an impact on demand. That's a big talking point. How will India is the largest market in the world. How will demand return? When will it return? And of course, the big question which some Indian scientists are raising now, is the third wave inevitable? Some say it is. And if it is, when will that happen? That could have a key impact, not only on the Indian market, but on the market worldwide. Looking in West Africa, the conversation around the crops goes on in Nigeria, to a certain extent in Ghana, but particularly in Cote d'Ivoire. And now we have the crop progressing, trade progressing in further west in Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, and the Gambia, which is why we thought it would be an ideal moment to get our two expert guests with us today. And there are questions too on freight costs and limited shipping availability, particularly from those ports, from Dakar, from Banjul, and from Bissau. The fourth talking point is, as always, about demand. And we're seeing demand post-lockdown, or at least at the beginning of the reopening, returning in India. And we're seeing both in Europe and the United States, or at least in the European Union and the United States, a decline in imports on 2020, which, we need to treat that with some caution, because 2020 was a year of all-time records on imports. Both regions would still be up on their 2019 imports, but down on last year, which is interesting, particularly as shipments from Vietnam would not be down to the same extent as the actual imports. So there's a question mark there. And a really interesting point, I think, and a real highlight of the year so far in terms of talking points, at least, is the increase in imports into China. Vietnamese customs figures are up by 76% on 2020. Now, you would expect them to be up, because don't forget that in February, early March of 2020, the trade between China and Vietnam was halted by the restrictions. But this number is quite remarkable. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on as we go on. So I'll start with the first talking point, the pandemic. Now, I'm not going to talk about I'm an expert on the pandemic. What I'm going to talk about is the impact of the current pandemic situation on the cashew business. And we'll start with India. I'll look at India and I'll look at Vietnam because these are the two key talking points this June. As you can see on the screen, India experienced a very severe second wave, huge numbers of cases. And we're now entering a stage where the economy, as they're calling it in India, is unlocking. And that's happening state by state. It's not consistent across the country. Of course, it's related to the impact of the pandemic. Markets are reopening. Some of the processing plants that were impacted are reopening or increasing their processing capacity again. There is fear of a third wave. That's mainly coming from scientists reported in the Indian press. But that would be a realistic fear, and it has been seen elsewhere. The impact on the cashew market in the first step is, of course, that processors buying imported RCN are a little bit reluctant to make decisions. And that's been reflected in the RCN market worldwide. So demand is returning. In India, as a huge consumer of cashew nuts, and particularly a consumer of cashew nuts for a very wide range of applications, with 60% by most estimates of Indian consumption being of cashews as ingredients, it's likely that that segment could return more slowly. So you would expect in that scenario that Indian demand for whole grades would recover more quickly than demand for broken grades. It's much easier to get cashew processing and distribution through retail markets up and running than it is to get factories back on track, people back working in factories, and those products processed, packed, and distributed. Indian demand for cashews is quite seasonal. It peaks during the Diwali festival toward the end of the year. This year, that'll be in the first week in November. And the two big questions arise, and the answer to these questions will have a huge impact on not only Indian demand for RCN, but for the supply-demand situation as 2020 unfolds, and particularly the carry-out stock at the end of the year. The two questions: will Indian consumers spend their money on food, particularly cashews regarded as a healthy food, an immune system boosting food, or will they save their money in case there's a third wave? Will people try to keep whatever money they have for healthcare in the event of a third wave? And that's a very real prospect. Second question I would ask, if there is a third wave, and let's hope there isn't, but if there is, what would happen if that occurred, let's say, late September, early October, in the run-up to Diwali? What would happen to processing? What would happen to stocks of raw cashew nuts in India? What would happen to fresh purchases at that stage, gearing up for purchasing from East Africa, particularly from Tanzania? The pandemic could have a big impact in India. If we look in Vietnam, we see, again, a surge in cases, but I just want to let you know that the cases in Vietnam, 250 cases in a day in the 14th of June. This is a very different story to India and indeed to most other countries. So Vietnam is getting some attention on the pandemic now, not because of a high number of cases and not because of widespread COVID, but simply because they were so successful last year. They get attention when even small restrictions happen. The cases are mainly, as you can see, in the northern part of the country and in and around Ho Chi Minh City. They're not in the major cashew processing or indeed growing, although that's passed now for this year, areas. And whereas we do see plenty of reports about Vietnamese COVID, this is not, at the moment, a major outbreak. We're seeing localized restrictions. There are restrictions on movement in and out of some areas. Processing continues. Export continues, as we know, because records are being broken every month. And there is some concern about whether there is a new variant in Vietnam, but that's, again, newspaper reports, and we don't know for sure yet. The potential impact in Vietnam is most likely on supply. So we're not talking about actual impact, we're talking about possible or potential impact. So if we talk about the impact in India, it's most likely to be on demand, particularly demand for raw cashew nuts from West Africa. But if we talk about the impact in Vietnam, if the situation were to deteriorate, we would be talking about an impact on the supply of cashew kernels. And if we look at the recent reactions in Vietnam, the first reaction seems to have been, much like it was last year, a reaction to sell kernels, which caused prices to slip down a bit. But the big question is, what would happen if Vietnam had a serious outbreak of COVID, which caused national restrictions? This would have a huge impact on the supply of kernels. It may have an impact on the distribution of raw cashew nuts. If it were to happen, the impact would be very high. But I have to say, at this point in time, the likelihood of that happening appears to be low. So I don't think we should expect any serious deterioration in Vietnam, but we should be vigilant and be looking out to see what's happening there. In fact, as we'll see, freight and logistics is having a much bigger impact than coronavirus on the cashew sector in Vietnam. So two countries, different level of impact of the pandemic, different type of level. In India, it's impacting demand. In Vietnam, potentially, it's impacting on supply. What have we seen on kernels prices lately? Well, let's have a look at our usual benchmark 320s grade. And what we've seen lately is a little dip in prices from Vietnam. We see prices still above the 2-year average. They've been there for a couple of months now, but dipped in the last week or so. Broken's prices still steady. So we see a dip in 320s, and Broken's, here you see splits and large pieces charted, both still relatively strong compared to the last 2.5 years. And we're looking at a range now in prices over the last 9-10 months between a low of 275, which we last saw in August 2020, briefly, but we primarily saw that low in the second quarter of 2020 in reaction to the pandemic. And a high, you have to go back a long time to find the high of the market in the last 2 years, and that's 335 back in September 2019. So the market's been relatively stable throughout the pandemic. We have seen some dips, in my opinion, completely unnecessary, completely unwarranted dips in price below $3 a pound. But the market is now maintaining its level, but it is relatively quiet in trading terms on kernels, up to yesterday evening at least. So if we have a look at, try and figure out what's happened in Vietnam, and if we think about why would Vietnamese processors reduce their prices, we could ask a few questions on that. Are RCN prices falling? They're not really. We did see some reaction early in reaction to the growing cases in Vietnam, growing coronavirus cases in Vietnam. We did see some slight decline in prices, but we're not seeing a significant fall in prices. Of course, prices have fallen for some origins, but that is often related to lower quality as the season progresses, and we have to be careful of that. You can't really quote an RCN price without asking, what's the outturn? What's the count of the nuts that are offered? We are seeing something of a struggle between fairly strong holders of raw cashew nuts and processors in Vietnam. Holders I've often said this during the second quarter of the year, what happens is that raw cashew nuts move from relatively weak holders, farmers, local traders, even exporters, and they move to very strong hands, well-financed trading companies, and eventually processors. And the negotiation of that is often a little bit of a standoff, and that's what we're seeing right now. We could also ask, is this a reaction to the coronavirus scare? And I think it is. I think in 2020, Vietnamese processors dropped prices quickly for no apparent reason, as demand was good, exports were good, just like now. Demands are pretty good, exports are very good. We could ask, are they selling to achieve cash flow? Seems unlikely. It is difficult to get shipments out anyway. Are buyers looking elsewhere? And I think that maybe the last two questions probably answer this. First of all, buyers are looking elsewhere. Buyers have difficulties getting the shipments they've already bought shipped, and therefore they're looking for options elsewhere. And we're going to talk about that in relation to West Africa shortly. Some are inevitably in the cashew business, and unfortunately, I guess some are reselling costs that they previously sold at much lower prices. And that's inevitable in our business, unfortunately. But I think there's a certain amount of that happening. So to a certain extent, I think this recent drop in price is more of a reaction. I don't think it's the beginning of any trend. I think the drop is marginal. I think as soon as buyers would return to the market, it would be wiped. We'd be back to where we were, and maybe even a little bit higher. Evidence of that is found in West Africa. And if we look at Africa, same chart, 320s, prices up around $3.40 FOB for WW320s, which I know for certain have among some of my clients. I know that these prices are well established. Now, that doesn't mean they're available to any processor. It means they're available to processors ready stock that is food safe certified. So if you're ready to take advantage of this as a processor, the opportunity is there right now. And it's coming from two aspects. So for some, mainly importers, smaller buyers, it's about freight cost. It's about the difference in the cost of freight from West Africa. It's about the faster delivery from West Africa compared to Vietnam at the moment. And it's about the reliability of delivery, not related to the processors, to the shipping situation and the general logistics. For others, and this is probably a long-term impact, for others, their interest in buying in West Africa. And I know of four particular major buyers significantly interested, and they're buying forward if they can too. It's about sustainability. It's about management of risk. It's about sourcing direct. It's about origin processing, about the quality that gives them. It's about the risk mitigation that gives them. And of course, it's about traceability. So for the first time in a long time, we're seeing African processors achieve higher prices, significantly higher prices than Vietnam. And if this were just the immediate difference in freight, we could say it's a short-term phenomenon. But I think because it's exceeded the short-term difference in freight, we may find that this is a much longer-term phenomenon, and this should be sustained with buyers, particularly European buyers, but I think also with North American buyers as time goes on. I'm not saying, of course, that the current premium will be maintained. What I'm saying is that African exporters will be on a much more equal footing, and they will not listen to this fallacy that we've heard in the past that Africa should somehow be a discount to Vietnam, which was never true. And now we see the exact opposite occur. But how does this arise? What are the driving factors behind this? And to see those, look in the impact of the pandemic on logistics and freight. If we take a quick look, South China Sea ports, places like Yintan, enormous congestion and reduced capacity. So the big story at the moment is the port of Yintan, which handles a remarkable 18 million containers a year, and it's only operating at 45% capacity. It had been operating as low as 20 due to a coronavirus scare and restrictions resulting. So this has resulted in spot rates going sky high. 40-foot containers from Asia to Northern Europe up around $20,000 for a container. The rates that frankly are unbelievable compared to where we were a year ago, certainly 18 months ago. Absolutely remarkable. And the thing about a globalized supply chain is that it's interconnected. Everything is interconnected now in the world shipping chain. And this system has been disrupted for 14 months. And the disruption is cumulative. So in Europe, you get congestion in ports, you get charges, you get short windows for export of containers, which then has the knock-on effect of delaying the return of containers where the major demand is. You get slight increases even in transatlantic freight rates, which seem to be far away from the ground zero of the crisis, but they're being impacted. And in the western states of the United States, for example, in California, you see major arrivals, large arrivals, but the capacity to move those containers away from the ports isn't great enough, which means the containers are taking much longer to turn around. So what we're seeing is a remarkable crisis in shipping. I was reading yesterday that there are 300 container ships waiting at ports for a berth. That's never been seen before. And this disruption is going to have an impact on our business. So first of all, we're seeing that the most sales are fixed price sales. So importers to roasters to retailers on a custom freight, on a delivered GDP basis, are having to manage freight costs up by 25, 30 cents a pound. This isn't just in cashews, of course. We're talking here about the impact of a whole range of industries. We're seeing shipment delays, longer sailing time from East Asia. We're seeing port congestion, not only in East Asian ports, but in European ports and in the United States. Of course, we're seeing falling inventories and spot markets very tight worldwide. So this logistics and freight that has taken a long time to build up is now at a crisis point. And if we look at this crisis, we see, for example, it's being highlighted that this undermines some of the basic ideas of supply chain management that have been with us probably since the 1990s. Lloyd's List, the authority on shipping worldwide, yesterday wrote that the latest ocean disruptions are highlighting the fragility of the just-in-time model. So just-in-time is based on fast turnaround, low inventories, rolling supply chains, move the product through. It's not based on stocks. It's not based on conservative approach. And now we're seeing that exposed in a pandemic. And that may well have long-term effect. On the lodestar.com, another news source for shipping information, they wrote yesterday, or they wrote on Monday, the shippers are facing a perfect storm as the logistics industry has entered an era of unprecedented disruption. Note, entered. They're not suggesting that this is coming to an end. They're not suggesting that this will pass in a week or two. It's entered an era of unprecedented disruption. This will not end soon. And in the cashew sector, Well, I'm calling it's double trouble because you've got two aspects to this. On the one hand, for kernels buyers, you've got, in general, an 80% dependence on a single origin, obviously Vietnam. You've got major freight disruption in that region. But not only is it the freight disruption on kernels, exports are the potential for that, but that origin, Vietnam, imports 80% of its RCN. And a huge proportion of that is from distance, from West Africa, from East Africa, from Indonesia. So that there is, in an ongoing logistics and freight crisis, a double impact for cashews. The impact on the import of RCN for processing and the impact on the export of kernels as that develops. And this is placing fundamental questions on the just-in-time system which most businesses worldwide operate. And the questions being asked are, should we not carry a buffer stock? Should we not manage our inventory a little bit differently? Should we depend so highly on one origin? Or should we spread our risk a little bit more? How do we manage fixed contracts in a system where not only the product can be volatile, but the freight can be volatile to a level now that we've never seen before? We've seen freight go up and down. We've seen freight rates as low as $300 for a foot container. We've seen them up to $1,000, but we've never previously seen anything like this. Why? Because we've never seen a pandemic like this, not in the era of containerized freight. Is this surprising? Well, I'm going to do something now we don't normally do. I'll tell you how GME highlighted this over the last year. We don't normally do I told you so, but I'm going to do it today. So if we look at this, and if you go back to the 3rd of June 2020, we pointed out on the GME that the concentration of processing increases risk volatility, that the long chain increases price volatility, creates contract risk, and so on. So these factors are known factors in the cashew sector, but they haven't been really addressed up to now. Back on the 27th of May, we talked about too much product to move. That's 27th of May 2020. We talked about too much product to move too far a distance in too little time. And whatever we said in May 2020, you can multiply that by 10 today. We talked about the impact on the supply chain, the impact of the pandemic. Back in February, we talked about the need for the highlighting of the weaknesses and the risk in the chain during a crisis, the risk of high dependence on a single origin, the risk of long chains, and the need for shorter supply chains. We also talked about the possibility of a set or a wave. So I'm not actually saying I told you so. What I'm saying is that these issues in our business have been known for a long time. This crisis has just brought them to a head. And it's pleasing on the one hand to see some kernels buyers now acting and some processors in West Africa acting to address these issues. But we need more support for processing, more development of processing to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And it's a pity that we are in this kind of a situation because demand for cashews is really strong. And if we take a look, demand, let's look at the Vietnamese exports. So the red bars are the current year 2021. So you've 3 years month by month exports there. And for 2021, you've got 5 years. So you can see that with the exception of February of the logistics problems. Having said that, the January to April figure is still 18% higher than 2019. So 2020 was a bumper start to the year for obvious reasons. 2021 has seen some kind of a fade back, but still well ahead of 2019. Position in the United States is remarkably similar. we see a lower imports in January and April, pretty positive performance in February and March. Overall, imports into the US are down by 5% in the period January to April 2021 as compared to last year. Again, I think this is the impact of logistics problems. If we look and compare to 2019, US demand is 13% higher, or US imports are 13% higher in the first 4 months of 2021. So generally quite a positive picture, but certainly it's disrupted. It's certainly disrupted by the freight and logistics situation as it's unfolded. What lessons can African processors learn? Well, I think this is a great opportunity. This really is an opportunity to crystallize the idea that the competitive advantages of African processing are not just monetary, that this is not a market that should be approached simply on the basis of price. African processors offer shorter transit times, and you can see on that little map transit times to North America and into Europe compared to normal transit times from India or Vietnam into both markets. You could probably add another 15, 16 days onto those. You can get a container to ship, and assuming you're prepared to pay maybe $10,000 for a 20-foot container. So price isn't everything. From a processing point of view in African countries, we have to realize that relationships matter, partnerships matter, risk management matters. Yeah, for certain, we need to hit the prerequisites for entry to the market. We need good quality cashew kernels, and we need good food safety systems. Processors need to eye with Food Safety Modernization Act for the USA, for European food law, for the European Union. And we need to realize, I found this quote from a sales trainer called Jack Daly, that selling is the transfer of trust. So the processor is trusted by his customer to deliver all of these things. And the sale is transferring that trust, convincing your buyer to transfer trust. And that's been sadly lacking as a skill for many African countries. But fortunately today, we can look at some really good examples in West Africa, in Benin, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Ghana, also in Mozambique. We can see great examples of businesses being able to do that, to convince their customers to transfer the trust. And in those situations, we're seeing an opportunity to hit all of these factors, to address the buyer's dependence on a single origin, to address the risk of long supply chains, to offer a more agile supply chain solutions, and to be part of this trend, this question mark over just-in-time inventory management, this question mark over long global supply chains that are possible to disrupt, and be part of the solution for shorter, nearer supply chains. And the really interesting thing, of course, is that African processors aren't adding any more product to the market. They're not flooding the market with additional stock. They're just changing where that product is processed and where the value is added. So there are a lot of lessons, and most of them positive for African processors. So let me summarize then before we go and talk to our guests. Factors to look out for around these talking points: crop, Indian demand, especially demand at this stage of the year. We need to get clues for that. The buying patterns, particularly of Indian buyers in Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, the Gambia too, will give us clues. If they become active, it's a sign that demand in India is returning to normal. We need to keep an eye on the progress of the coronavirus in Vietnam, just in case that unlikely eventuality happens and we do get a major outbreak there. I think we need to be realistic and say that these freight problems will not be fixed quickly. And we can assume almost certainly that there will be freight difficulties, certainly through to the end of this year and probably beyond that. Not as extreme as they are today, but they will be there. And these provide opportunities for West African processors in particular, and I say that ports in West Africa are that bit closer to east coast of the US or the major European ports, but also for East African processing. There will be significant opportunities there as time goes on. And I think it's time for processors not just to look at this as a short-term opportunity.
Recording in progress. So people who are buying right now are based
on the availability of working capital and more preparation particularly by processors. I always think exporters are maybe better at this, exporters of RCN, but by processors to present their case, and that their case is based on good relationships with kernel buyers, rather than on some vague idea that we'll process it and someone will buy it from us. What about the crop in the Gambia? What about shipping from the Gambia? What's the position in the port at Banjul for the moment?
Port, as usual, has been in the recent times quite congested, and availability of containers has been a challenge. From an earlier shipping frequency of a ship a week, we are now down to a ship a month. Empty containers are a challenge. Like John did say that quite a few shipping companies prefer to offtake their empties and take them straight to China because of the huge freights that you have mentioned as well, that they're able to get rather than ship them with goods to say India and then move them on to China. The another point in the shipping line circuit was not just the congestion at the ship load port or the end port, but our goods move in transit. And the ports of Algeciras and Salalah, which were very common transit points, they're congested as well. And the shipping lines don't want any containers on transit there. So one solution could be a direct vessel. If the cashew industry can get together, I mean, the private sector can get together and look at, if not chartering a bulk vessel, look at a direct shipment to India that may ease this transit congestion that we have been mentioning. The ports in India can receive containers for sure, and the export ports, most of them can ship out containers. I mean, there is slight congestion in the port here as well, but it can be managed if there is a direct vessel and the availability of containers. That has been a challenge. Right now, we have just a ship, one vessel a month from here. Crop is more. I mean, the Gambian crop has always been something of a let's say. I can see you smiling, Jim. And I'm sure quite a few others will be having but ever since Senegal did block the borders, the flow of cargo from Bissau into Senegal, that possibly continues, but from Senegal to the Gambia has been heavily restricted. All the same, we've been doing about 30 to 40,000 tons out of Gambia with a local crop, possibly about 20,000. So there is still possibly the borderline area villages that do supply cashew to this side without actually having to it be lifted across the border points. So I believe the crop size will be similar to last year, maybe a slightly shorter crop. Jim, one point I would like to mention here is Gambia. When we started Gambia in the earlys, we used to talk about 55 and 56 pound cargo. 54 used to be the low point. with a 200 nut count. And now today we are looking at 52s and 53s being the best we can get. Nut counts are slow increasing, and this is possibly due to the plant. I mean, there are a lot of people who do to try to bring in Malian crop through Gambia to export. Try to profit on the value that we get, the additional value. And over the years, we have noticed that the unsold crop eventually lands up in the hands of some chaps making little pots of cashews and selling them as cashew plants. And we've seen an infiltration of poor quality compared to what we built up here since '98 with exclusive Sokon variety, these lovely varieties that we had got early days.
Yeah.
Many people are planting anything that they get their hands on in the guise of planting cashews, planting trees, and that unfortunately is hurting our reputation in the Gambia. These trucks do come in and are at some places mixed. So we are facing a kind of a Benin situation, say in the 90s, where cross-border low quality from the other side would come in and be mixed with top-class Soko. I remember it was Savalu region cashew, which unfortunately dented the quality of the crop there as well. So I guess precautions have to be taken. We have a screening method, but if speculators are in the business, it's very difficult to ensure that the quality remains what it was.
It's a shame. It's a shame because the reputation of Gambia was really high. I suppose one of the factors I often think is that the key thing that's missing in a lot of our RCN trade is that quality is not fairly rewarded, and therefore that the encouragement to plant better varieties, look after them better, and to produce a better quality product is not as great as it should be. I hope that as quality becomes more and more a factor, there's no question in kernels we've seen a loss of quality over the past 10 or 15 years. And that, I think, goes right across the sectors. And that's not necessarily related to the quality of RCN coming in either. Perhaps India would be a different story, but certainly product coming out of Vietnam. And I often think that there's a lot of people in markets here in Europe, for example, who've never really seen a top quality cashew kernel. So quality is really an issue that I would like to see much more focus on. You see organizations talking about capacity, but I think they should also look at the quality of the product that's being produced.
Certainly. Coming to quality, there's another point because of the transit time increases and early rains and humidity being an issue, one thing which we really need to focus on is ensuring that dry cargo gets into the containers, because very good quality could get damaged by a slide with a little moisture. There are some really good moisture absorbent packages available now, which seem to be able to handle the moisture. Must encourage people to use dry well, and to ensure that they do understand that the transit times have now increased from the 30 to 40 day period to a 50 to 60, possibly more delays on route. So to ensure that the cargo is really, really dry and well packed with your container craft paper and dry bags of the right type. There are some poor quality dry bags which do absorb moisture, but the moment they go over 2 kilos, they break and then are the cause of further damage themselves. So people should make sure that they've got dry bags that can take care of this. The gel type dry bags, for instance, we have found that we have had zero moisture issues shipping with a good, slightly not too expensive actually. If we look at the cost benefit analysis, then it's actually much cheaper to put these.
So yes, people are becoming a lot more quality conscious. Another interesting change, which I'm sure Ram will be a witness to, is that, let's say 15, 20 years ago, you didn't see a lot of drying yards attached to warehouses in the south. I mean, probably a lot of landlords thought it was a waste of money. I mean, to just leave some land open. Today, you will not find any cashew warehouse, especially the new ones that are being constructed, without at least half of the space being devoted to a drying yard, or at least a drying area. So yes, drying has caught up. Also, Bissau is one of the few countries in West Africa where we don't receive a lot of goods in PP bags from the bush. I mean, we actually give out jute bags in advance, and goods are packed in jute bags right from the starting point, right from the farm gate. So these are some good steps. Having said that, this year, definitely we're going to see, we have a thumb rule of a 1% weight loss per month for every month that the goods stay in the warehouse. So yes, with an increase in shipping lead times, there is going to be more weight loss at our end. And it remains to be seen how it will be handled. Otherwise, no significantly higher moisture issues this year.
Right. But it does sound to me, listening to both, that buyers would do well to act in the market fairly soon. That delaying is probably not going to do them any good. And it's, again, I think the key to that is the lockdown situation, particularly as it's lifted in India.
Jim, let me share a conversation I had with one of my buyers in India a couple of days ago. So he's also a good friend. So I say, so what do I do? Do I hold or do I sell at current prices? Or do I ship at least or float cargo at current prices? He says, if you wait, there are chances the prices will go up. If you wait too long, there are chances you will not get a container. And if you don't ship in time and we don't receive goods in time, not only will we be too late for Diwali, which, as you pointed out, is the high point of the cashew season in India. He says the southern crops will also start. So then maybe our interest in the northern crops will go down. So yes, I mean, we guys are caught between a rock and a hard place out here right now in Bissau. We're just buying, holding goods, and praying a lot. A lot more people are becoming religious this year.
I'm quite familiar with that in a slightly different context, in the trading of kernels. Let me pass back to Ernest, who I think has maybe some of his own questions and some questions from some of our participants. Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim, and welcome once again, Ram and John. I was talking to Ram probably less than a month ago. We had met in Gambia, and it's a pleasure to have you here and share with us also what is going on with the season there. There are three questions, but I think by and large you have dealt with the first one, which has to do with the logistics and the freight issues. But then the other question has to do with the other questions have to do with government policies and interventions currently in Gambia and Guinea-Bissau. In which direction is it going? Is there any support coming from government, particularly if you take also Guinea-Bissau and Senegal, the situation with the ports there? What are some of the policies that are coming up, which in your view will promote the crop in this part of the region? Then tied to that is the second question on the outlook of production in the coming years. All the trees are old now in most parts, particularly in Guinea-Bissau, and what in your view needs to be quickly done to address the situation. So maybe we can take the first one, which has to do with government policy intervention currently in the sub-region.
Thanks, Ernest. Yes, it was a pleasure meeting you and seeing you in Gambia for a long time. And also, before I move ahead, I just wanted to show this to Jim. Jim, do you remember this one?
We did it.
Yes, this was our cashew conference in the Gambia. We had a signed T-shirt by everybody, the whole team that worked. I still have kept that as a souvenir. With your signature.
Very encouraging.
And I think there's something which, if Christian was on board, the Rhapsody moment in Ghana, where we decided to, the three of us, where Jim, myself, and Christian decided to start the equipment expo. I think that is the first conference that we actually exhibited equipment.
Actually, we are all missing the physical conferences. I mean, we should get back to the point where it is possible to fully.
I'm sure. Maybe again in Gambia. Gambia is pretty safe now.
I can see that.
This man never misses an opportunity, does he?
Bring the conference back to Gambia. Okay, coming to your question on political will. I think Gambia has been one country where we've been able to work very closely with government without too much of an overbearing influence, where they have always supported the private sector and not had to dictate terms on, say, taxing, etc. So Gambia has been very positive in that sense. We have a constraint at the port where the government is trying to expand the port, but it's been locked down with a few different bids coming from different countries, assistance, different agencies. I think DP World had something to do with it. Maersk was trying. Indian government offered some soft loans, and the Chinese government was offering some loans. So tied between this, they haven't yet taken a decision. But I do believe that the government is trying to increase the infrastructure for all exports, which will hugely benefit the cashew industry, because cashew is something that needs to be shipped out in time. It is relatively perishable. If not dried well, then cashew stuck in a container can be a disaster. You can have a plantation in a container. So yes, on the account of government influencing the industry, it's been background in the Gambia, but they are there and they do help. We have a Chamber of Commerce that constantly helps us approach the Ministry of Trade without being the boss, as in some other countries where they try to play make the rules, set the rules, and ensure that there is always a problem when you have to go. They create the problem most of the time, but here in the Gambia, it's been pretty good. I'm quite sure in Senegal as well, it is quite positive. There's a little interference, except the fact that they don't allow the free trade of cashew across the borders. But that's Senegal's prerogative, because they need to add value to their ports. So we can understand that as well from their end. Coming to production, I think there are quite a few interventions. I did mention one constraint of this intervention is where most of the development partners don't look at the variety while planting, while offering seedlings. They'll pick up seedlings from anybody who's growing seedlings, and we don't know the source of these seedlings, and which is one reason why the quality of cashew in Gambia has been going down. When we started with a zero crop to a crop which was where we had taught them how to plant, taught them post-harvest maintenance. We invested a lot as a private sector, along with the ACA, with the USAID. We got together and trained people on quality. That, unfortunately, as the volume's grown up, and the interest in selling Gambian cashew with a Gambian origin tag has probably negatively influenced our quality. So on the production side, there are a few interventions right now. I think Shelter for Life is here, and they are doing some work. We have not yet been directly involved with them, barring our last meeting along with you, and we hope that they will be careful when they are furthering the cause of growing more cashew. There is potential to grow more cashew, good cashew here in the Gambia. The climate is ideal. Normally the rains are a little later, so we normally get to dry quite a lot before the onset of the monsoons or the rains. I think interventions are there, but I always felt that cashew was possibly a slightly more pampered crop in terms of farmers, because the farmers they plant once and then they have to keep going. So there is excellent development scope in the cashew industry, because the value chain can accommodate a few middlemen, and each middleman feeds a family here. So the development scope of cashew as a poverty alleviating tool is fantastic. It's really proved itself over the years that cashew can really feed many families before it reaches the processor. And this is something which we have been trying to do right through. At every conference, I've tried to look at value addition right from the growing stage, rather than value addition in terms. Zikinshore is becoming a port that gets more active. So it's in their interest. Hats off to Senegal for being able to effectively valorize the port of Zikinshore. There's a new port coming at Fundigoon, or place near Kaolack, which will soon also take the the North Senegal crop out. So I do believe Gambia may show a decline in the export, but Gambian production will definitely be up. What quality is my? I have a little doubt that our quality will ever hit 54 pounds again, unless we concentrate on certain areas. I hope I've answered that.
Yeah, very good. Yes, thanks, Ram. So, John, pretty much the same question. Government intervention, or what policies government are putting in place in Guinea-Bissau, and in your view, what trend we will experience with production in the coming years?
Ernest, very surprisingly, in Guinea-Bissau, very little in terms of policy or in terms of special infrastructure for cashew processing or even cashew exports has been put in place by the government. The operators, the economic operators, operate pretty much independently. The government just looks at it from a taxation point of view. Even most of the farms out here are small holdings, as you know, of 2 to 3 acres. 97% of the Guinea-Bissau crop is basically from small farmers of having holdings of 2 to 3 acres. I mean, as Ram pointed out, the financing is a big issue, be it for exports or be it even for processing. On paper, the banks give you rates of anything between 9 to 10 or 9 to 11%. But then there are so many other add-on charges, your dossier fees, your decasma fees, and all those kinds of things. So finally, it works out to the same 16 to 18 to 20%. And if you have to hold inventory, again, if you have to buy during 1.5 months and then do your processing during the next 10 months, that means you're going to hold inventory for at least 8 to 10 months. I mean, there is no way you're going to be able to pay for that if you're going to pay your financing charges at the rate of 18%. And cashew really doesn't have that kind of, profit margin. There are some other products in Bissau maybe that have that kind of margin, but it's not cashew. And so that is one issue. At least the government could have provided some kind of, a letter of comfort or something to banks to enable them to finance the cashew trade. Interestingly, in Guinea-Bissau, the months of February and March are called the months of hunger, because most of the cashew processors and the farmers have run out of their money by the time they get to February or March. And it's really the pre-financing done in the form of rice by the cashew exporters that keeps, the household fires burning for the next 2 to 3 months before the cashew crop comes in. And in spite of that, processing, the government now wants to bring in some rules, making it obligatory for an exporter to at least have a proposal for processing for the 2022 season. Let's see how far that goes. I mean, it's good to have these proposals, but in the absence of any special policy or any incentives to cover the problems with starting the cashew processing sector in the country, like so many people have pointed out, I mean, the lack of a market for brokens, the high cost of power, all these other factors, and the non-usage of byproducts out here. All these are problems that we face. And if the government is unable to give at least some level of incentives to cover these kinds of drawbacks, it's difficult. It's only those brave guys who will go forward and put up processing units. And that's the way forward. I mean, like Jim has been mentioning, I think in practically all of his sessions. I mean, look at the map, look at the circuitous route that the RCN takes before getting processed and going to the end markets in Europe and the US. I mean, it makes eminent sense to process and export from Africa. And if we're really able to get our act right in terms of policy, in terms of quality standardization, traceability, these kinds of things, there's absolutely no reason why West Africa should not take off as a processing base. So yes, coming to the financial part, yes, it's all at the risk of the entrepreneur or the exporter. And that's the reason why we don't see such huge strides or such huge growth coming up in these sectors in Guinea-Bissau specifically. One point I would like to make in terms of infrastructure and shipping also. I mean, I think the least the governments could do is increase the maximum summer draft, do a bit of dredging at the ports. I was talking to one of the Kosama captains who had come down to make a presentation of DP World to us. This is a problem not just at the port of Bissau, but even at the port of Ziguinchor. They have vessels that can take 500 boxes each, but they load max 150 to 200 boxes because the maximum summer draft just doesn't permit a vessel to load at full capacity. I mean, this is really total underutilization of available capacity. We're not even talking about constructing new quays or new ports and things like that. Just a simple thing like dredging, desilting. And these would go a long way in helping us solve the logistics problems. And we do hope that the necessary authorities would consider these points. That's from me, Ernest.
If I may just add, I'm sorry, if I may just add.
Thanks, John. Ram, please go ahead and add here.
No, just a small adding to that. I mean, I used to drive. We also do business in Bissau, and I used to drive, twice, at least a month to Bissau when the season was on. I haven't been to Bissau for 1.5 years because the road from Ziguinchor to, which is one of the main cashew belts. Bissau, the whole country is a cashew belt. To Ziguinchor to Bissau, which used to take me about 2 hours, takes me about 7 hours now, and the cars are right off at each trip. The roads have gone so bad. So let alone the port infrastructure, if the government of Guinea-Bissau could concentrate on its road infrastructure, there would be a lot more trade, quicker trade happening there. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, John.
Ram, I think you're very right. In fact, a sad part of this season, a sad reality of this season has been almost every week, some remorque crashing into a bunch of people, overturning and killing people. Almost every week there have been deaths related to the movement of cashew from the bush to Bissau. In fact, one was so serious, the government even declared a day of mourning and things like that. So it is really sad. I mean, the infrastructure does need to be improved.
Yeah, I think I've done that journey also recently, and I agree with you. It takes a very long time, and the roads are very bad. So definitely road infrastructure is also one of them. And then earlier on, John, you also mentioned the issue of the pre-season where there is the hunger, and then the rice becomes another thing that is also in a way pond or some kind of arrangement, which ultimately also deepens the cycle of poverty there, because when the season will start, then the prices are determined sometimes even twice the value of the price that is the rice that is given. So I think there are a number of issues which we will touch on much later in another session, where we talk deeply into the policy issues in the different countries. So Jim, there's no further questions from my end. So maybe you take over, and then much later we come back to Ram and John when there are questions at the end of the session.
Thanks, Ernest. Thank you, Ram. Thank you, John. We'll come back to you with further questions at the end of the session. I just wanted to wind up this series we've been doing called Cashewnomics. And if you recall, if you've attended the different events, we talked about India and Vietnam, and we talked about the strains in the supply chain and how those two cashew giants are changing, particularly Vietnam. And we talked about the opportunity. And I just want to wind up this Cashewnomics series under this phrase, let's not be looking back in anger. Why do I say that? I say it because I think there is now a renewed opportunity. There have been many generations of cashew development in African countries, both on processing going back to the 1970s, the 1980s, different generations in East Africa, and more recently in West Africa. But I think now there is a particular opportunity, and I hope that that's not missed. And I think the key things, first of all, to point out, and these are summaries of different slides that we've used over the last 3 sessions. First of all, this interest in buying kernels in African countries is increasing from the buyer's point of view for reasons of risk management, for reasons of high dependence on a single origin. You can see in 2019 on the chart in the top left, USA with an 86% dependence on Vietnam. It's not healthy, not from their point of view, not from anyone's point of view, not even from the Vietnamese point of view, in fact. We can also see aspects like food safety, sustainability, transparency in the chain emerging and becoming stronger. And there are threats to long-term demand growth. And that many of these threats actually emerge from this complex supply chain that we work in the long journey of much of the nuts to market. I don't think that there will ever be a 100% processing of the crop in West Africa. I think there's always going to be good reason to export, particularly to India, and certainly to Vietnam as time goes on. But there should be a greater balance in that. One of the reasons, as we've heard from our knowledgeable contributors today, is the fact that African processors struggle to match the costs of Vietnamese processors. It's about things like cost of utilities, cost of logistics, and particularly the availability and the cost of working capital. There are interesting cases, interesting success stories in African countries today, and they are bridging the gap one way and another. But this cost gap is very, very important to bridge, and particularly from the point of view of changing the way that the investment in this sector happens, so that it's not as much invested in logistics and movement of product, certainly not 2 million tons. And we struggle with 2 million tons of shipments today. What if that were 3 or 4, eventually 5 million tons? It just wouldn't work. I think because of that and because of the risk, that what's become evident in the last 18 months is that price is becoming less important. Price is important, but it's becoming less important. But competitiveness will always be important. And this is part of the opportunity to become competitive processor, whatever that takes. If we look at the trend in processing, we've seen an interruption in the last 2 years, actually. Pre-pandemic, processing was coming under pressure following many years of growth year on year. That may well be slightly addressed again in 2021, but this trend needs to be looked at. And we also need to look at policies in this respect, in policies and how we support processing, not only whether we support processing, but how it's done. We need to look at some of the new models that we're seeing in processing. We're seeing competitiveness based on scale. If you remember when we talked about processing in African countries last time, we talked about getting the scale right. We talked about partnership. We talked about sustainability. And when we look at this, we also see successful businesses, not as large yet, but based on higher levels of value addition, consumer packing, roasting, preparation of ingredients, low foreign matter, and competitiveness based on branding and marketing. My point is that it's not just about price, that this market is changing and what buyers are looking for in this market is changing, and that's an opportunity for the African sector. It's also an opportunity for traders and exporters of raw cashew nuts, who may well find, as Ram says rightly, may well find that they have customers in Tanzania or in Mozambique or in South Africa, as well as in India and Vietnam. We look at the supports and the strategies for process, and we see the contrast between heavily involved governments in Tanzania, in Cote d'Ivoire, and a lighter touch, as John told us, in Guinea-Bissau. The fact is that in the cashew sector, in this midst of an opportunity, that poor policy making, and we have seen some examples of that, not recently actually, it's much improved, but poor policy making and failure to consider, not only on part of policymakers, but on the part of development organizations intervening in the sector. You know, the case there that Ram mentioned of the additional planting of cashews, well, that's a good idea, but let's consider the quality of the seedlings. Let's consider the products that's eventually produced, and let's approach this as an ingredient, as a foodstuff, and not simply as a commodity pipeline sold cheap. I think we have to look at, and you'll remember this, the problems from the first session on cashewnomics. We talked about the lessons from India and Vietnam. We talked about some of the approaches in African countries. It's important to learn from the past. It's important to learn from the success in India and the success in Vietnam of the cashew sector, to learn from the best and to avoid those mistakes. And if we look at the industry today in Asia, and particularly in Vietnam, it's huge. It's grown very big, but it's not really clear whether it's profitable or not. And the sustainability of an industry based on, I think it was 82% imports last year, is also a question mark. And African processors, African governments, development agencies, traders need to look at that and learn from their mistakes. We have to understand that the pandemic, all its influences, as we've talked about, in Bissau, to kernels from Ho Chi Minh City, to port congestion in Antwerp, all of these things are tied together. The supply chain is changing. The risk in long supply chains, the lack of agility, the need for greater transparency and indeed traceability is not a demand from buyers, it's an opportunity for the sector to develop. Today, only in African countries can you guarantee for the entire processed volume traceability, if that were put in place. It's very difficult to do if you're a major importer. And from a Vietnamese point of view, much more so importing and re-exporting. The situation in India as the biggest consumer in the world is a different situation. So we have to learn from the pandemic. And I think if we don't, it's possible that we will be looking back 10 years from now and thinking that was really an opportunity. That was something that we missed. That was a time to turn the tide. We had, whilst it was happening, we had our heads down thinking about short-term factors. I call this the cashew world. And I think that this not only applies to cashews, it applies to a lot of products, a lot of food commodities. And I think that we've seen in evidence on the disruption to the supply chain that the focus on cost efficiency is changing. That's not to say that cost competitiveness is unimportant. Of course, it's important. But now there's an emphasis also on resilience and adaptability. This was a trend that was emerging. This is a trend which you walk around any supermarket in a major European country and you can feel this trend coming at you from the shelves. You see it on the packaging, you see it in the advertising, you see it in the types of products and how they're presented. This resilience and adaptability is absolutely something that favors the development of the cashew sector in Africa, whether that's increased production, better logistics for exports, more processing, more value addition. And this is being accentuated by the crisis that we're in, a different way of looking at sustainability, the idea of, and we saw the quotation from Lloyd's List, an eminent supply chain organization questioning the validity of just-in-time stock management. So where does the demand for lower prices from buyers in Europe and the United States comes from? It comes from, since the 1990s, for the idea that everything had to be lean. It had to be cheaper, it had to be leaner, it had to be later, and it had to be faster. And that's changing. Because I think people have realized that that's just not sustainable. And it's not sustainable financially, and it's not sustainable environmentally, and it's not sustainable for societies. And when we look at this, the developments that we see present us with an opportunity. So I say, let's not look back in anger. Let's see these as long-term opportunities. Let's think about this industry in the longer term, as well as dealing with the short-term issues, and address problems of infrastructure, dredging in the port of Bissau, can have long-term impact if it, as John explained to us. Improved infrastructure, improved trade between African countries, so many other things that need to be done. We need to ask ourselves, are we thinking long-term? And if we're not, we'll miss the opportunity. So thanks very much indeed. I would like again to thank our guests, Mr. Ram Mohan, Mr. John Rao, for their really expert contributions. It's been a pleasure. And I will pass you back to Ernest for any further questions.
Yes.
So we should look at the trend up to 2020. So I think there's competitiveness in volatile markets. I think that's a huge issue. I think the availability of working capital, the attractiveness of, even if you do have a developed supply chain, this applies in some countries more than others, but the fact that if you have a supply chain and you're able to source RCN and the market's going up $50, $75, $100 in a week, the temptation to close the doors of your factory and resell the RCN was, too much for people. They probably made some money out of it. You knock that. That's what they're there to do. They want to make some money, so they decided they would take the short-term advantage of a profit on the RCN. I can't criticize that. It's a pity, in so much as that it does interrupt the long-term development, but it is a fact of life in volatile markets. And what we would be better to do is to enable those businesses to be supported with finance and other technical assistance so that they won't see the need to do that. So that's a factor. So volatility is definitely going to interrupt steady process. If you take the period from 2012 all the way through to 2016, you had steady growth in processing in our countries. This is mainly in West Africa. In that period, you probably had a decline in processing in East Africa, particularly in Tanzania, but you'd growth elsewhere. And then it's interrupted by market volatility. Then you get 2 years of relatively low prices for raw cashew nuts, but processing is a difficult thing to switch on and switch off. And so the problems of competitiveness emerged again. Again, if you see a bank looking at a business and they buy their raw cashew nuts in February, March, April, May, in 2018 and 2019, by June, July, prices were lower and they struggled to make a profit. The banks looked at that in the following year. They restricted the access to working capital, and perhaps not only banks, but proprietors, parent companies did the same. So possibly without really understanding what the volatility meant and the opportunity that laid ahead over the longer period, they restricted. So there's a whole range of issues there that impact into this. We could also talk about changeovers in technology. We could talk about a number of factories that were established, let's say between 2010 and 2015, that had bought technology that by 2017-18 was obsolete, or if not obsolete, behind the times, or with which they struggled. Poor procurement, poor setup of factories, the wrong scale. So we've seen a lot of those smaller factories that were set up with the best of intentions from 2011, 2012. And if you look in Benin, you'll see examples. If you look in Cote d'Ivoire, you'll see examples that they struggled because they built to capacities of 2,000 tons, 2,500 tons. And you had this combination of a lack of working capital. I know of cases where factories were built, and as soon as the factory was ready, the owners realized they hadn't got the working capital to operate it. That the factories were built and the equipment installed was just a mismatch. It didn't go together very well, or the wrong equipment wasn't installed, or it was not commissioned properly, which was a problem then, but less of a problem now. What we're seeing now is we're seeing a tendency toward larger factories, more professional organizations, better business planning. And I think this situation by the end of 2021 will look far better. And I think that the growth will be restored. But what these last 5 years have told us is that we cannot take for granted that there will be a growth in processing. we cannot take for granted either that there will be a growth in production. That needs to be nurtured, it needs to be managed, and the private sector needs to be supported by the public sector in doing that.
Thank you very much, Jim. There won't be time for any further questions, so maybe I give you a minute to give your closing remarks and also any other information that you want to share with us before I bring the session to a close.
Well, let me thank everyone for joining us this morning. I particularly would like to thank Ram Mohan for his expert contributions and John Rao for his contributions. And they have both helped us to understand the current situation in that part and that very important part of the cashew market in Africa and in the world. We're going to move on. In 2 weeks, we're going to get back to a more cashewnomics season is finished. We're going to talk about the 2021 season in West Africa, how that's developed and how markets are, and we'll return to some of these issues. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ernest, for the opportunity, and wish you all the very best, and take care in this market. It's not an easy one. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks so much, John and Ram. And thanks to our participants. So we come your way again on the 30th of June with Fitzpatrick's session. We will be having next week, Wednesday, 23rd June, the Cashew Technical Series with Shakti Power. So thanks to everyone, and see you again next week. Bye-bye to all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Ernest and Jim. Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.
Recording stopped.